Is there dignity in death? What happens to our bodies after we die? I imagine that most of us would like to believe that we'll be treated with care and respect. But how can we possibly ensure this? After all, we'll be nothing more than a shell of ourselves. An empty husk, with no more agency than a newborn infant. Less, actually. We'll be at the complete mercy of those in charge. Our physicians, our doctors, and our coroners. It's quite comforting to believe that death is the absolute worst thing that'll ever happen to us. But what if it isn't? What if death is only the beginning of the horror? Today we'll be covering topics such as murder, sexual assault, and necrophilia. So considering the nature of the subject matter we're about to discuss, viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Take the remote unit from its handy storage space, and you're set for hours of pure pleasure. Enjoy your favorite programs, black and white or color. Turn the set on, select your channel,
So let's set the scene. It's the night of June 22nd of the year 1987, and a young woman known as Wendy is spending the summer evening with her partner, Ian. At approximately midnight, the young couple returns to Wendy's apartment as she has work the following morning and needs to get to sleep. Once outside her apartment, the couple embraces and says their goodbyes. Little did the two young adults know this was the very last time they'd ever touch one another. The next day, Ian is awoken by a worried phone call from Wendy's co-workers. The young woman hadn't shown up for work that morning. This kind of behavior was very out of character for Wendy, prompting the phone call from her colleagues. With his mind swirling with worried thoughts, Ian immediately made his way back over to his girlfriend's apartment, only to make a truly gruesome discovery. Ian located his girlfriend's dead body, lying naked and covered in blood upon the floor. Ian immediately phoned the authorities and an investigation got underway. Wendy had been beaten quite savagely and then strangled to death. Whoever had committed this despicable crime had also forced himself upon the helpless young woman, and due to this, there was some DNA evidence left behind at the scene for investigators to collect. However, considering the time period that this crime took place in, this wasn't really all that helpful to detectives. Wendy's apartment was thoroughly searched by investigators, and it was found that there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the home. It was eventually discovered that whoever had committed this crime had managed to gain entry through the apartment's back window. The window was in no way secure due to the fact that the latch had been completely painted over at some time in the past. It appeared that the killer had Wendy under surveillance, and when she left with her boyfriend, he took his chance to gain entry to the apartment through the faulty window and hid somewhere inside, waiting for the young woman to return. As we know, all too often the killer turns out to be someone that is known to the victim, and so the authorities began to investigate Wendy's personal life in order to determine if there were any jealous exes who might have taken their chance to get revenge for some perceived slight. However, investigators couldn't find anything at all to corroborate this notion. By all accounts, Wendy was a very well-liked and popular young woman. It seemed that there was not even a single person who held a shred of animosity for Wendy, and this left the police completely baffled. In another area of the investigation, though, they would be far more lucky. From the clothing that Wendy was wearing when she was killed, investigators found a single shoe print. The most likely match for this print was a Clark Sports tennis shoe. Investigators also noted that the killer had stolen Wendy's diary, purse, and keychain, most likely as a kind of morbid keepsake. Interestingly, just a few days prior to Wendy's murder, a woman who lived only a few doors down from Wendy was relaxing at home when there was a knock at her front door. This was around 8 p.m. at night, and when the woman opened her door, she saw a man she didn't recognize standing there. Horrifically, this creepy man informed the woman that she shouldn't keep her windows open at night, especially her bedroom window. A very strange occurrence, yes, but under other circumstances, one that you could probably just shrug off. However, due to the horrible events that took place just days later, we should view this event in a much more sinister light. Following this ominous proclamation, the strange man turned and hurried away, no doubt leaving the young woman completely shook. Sadly, it would only be a short 5 months after the despicable murder of Wendy that the killer would strike again. On the 24th of November, at approximately midnight, Caroline Pierce, a local woman, had just taken a cab back to her apartment following a night out with a few of her friends. As the taxi pulled away, the driver spotted Caroline making it into her apartment safely. However, the following morning, she never arrived to work. This prompted her family and friends to panic when they failed to locate and get into contact with her. Obviously, concerns among the community were quite strong that Caroline had suffered the same grisly fate as Wendy just months prior. The investigating detectives spoke with some of Caroline's neighbors, who claimed they'd heard screaming the night before. Caroline had vanished, and due to these reports, the authorities were treating the case as a possible abduction. The police quickly discovered that, between the two cases, there were some alarming similarities. Both women worked as a shop assistant on the very same street, and both women lived alone in an apartment that was within just a mile of one another. Once again, detectives searched for anyone close to Caroline who might have wanted to do her harm, and, once again, they came away completely empty-handed. By all appearances, Caroline was a very well-liked individual with a large group of close friends. As the very last person to see her alive, the cab driver was questioned, but was ruled out almost immediately. Tragically, on December 15th, just 3 weeks after Caroline had initially gone missing, her decomposing body was discovered by a local farmer lying in a drainage ditch. The young woman was wearing the exact same clothes that she was when she went missing, and it was obvious to everyone that she had been in that ditch for quite a while. Sadly, Caroline had suffered the exact same fate as Wendy before her. She had been severely beaten and strangled to death, and once again the killer had forced himself upon his victim. It was apparent to everyone that there was a serial killer on the loose. However, despite the intensity of the investigation, these horrific murders would go unsolved for decades. By the year 1999, however, advances in forensic science had progressed to the point that the authorities were able to build a complete DNA profile of the killer. And, for the first time, this officially linked the two murders together under one single case. Unfortunately, a direct match in the database wasn't found. However, they were able to come up with 1,000 possible relatives of the murderer. These 1,000 names were then taken and narrowed down to 91 priority names. And of those 91 men, it was then whittled down even further until only one name remained. The monster that committed these deplorable crimes was a man known as David Fuller. David was 66 years old and a father of two who worked as an electrician at a local hospital. Following his arrest, David's home was thoroughly searched by the authorities, and there they made a few damning discoveries, including a photograph of Mr. Fuller wearing the exact same kind of footwear as the shoe print they had located at the scene of the crime. Investigators also uncovered the fact that during the 1980s, David was a member of a local cycling club whose route would often take the cyclist right past the homes of the victims. But that wasn't all. The police also found evidence that David had actually met both victims at some point in the past. After all, it was discovered that the murderer was a somewhat regular customer at the two stores that both women worked at. And the discoveries didn't stop there either. Found taped to the back of a cupboard, police located 4 separate hard drives. Even with already knowing what this man was capable of, the detectives were shocked when they saw just what was on those hard drives. On them were hundreds of videos and pictures that depicted David committing despicable acts with the dead in the morgue of the very hospital where he was employed. David had been working at various hospitals in the region for well over 30 years, and considering the sheer length of his employment, it's likely that we'll never know just how many people this horrible man victimized. On these hard drives were millions of images of David engaged in unspeakable acts. He even went so far as to name these folders of images after his victims. David would even sink so low as to actually work night shifts at the hospital just so that he could carry out his heinous deeds without other members of staff catching him in the act. And once the foul deed was finished, David would go home, log onto his computer, and look up the social media profiles of his victims. In a truly disgusting move, he would even look up and read statements that were made by grieving loved ones of the victims. As so often is the case, people who knew David in real life described him as being an ordinary and polite man. It just goes to show, you can never really know what someone is truly capable of. During his trial, David initially pleaded not guilty to manslaughter based on the grounds of diminished responsibility. However, on the 4th of November 2021, he would change his plea to guilty. Eventually, David Fuller would be sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning that he'll die in prison, and rightfully so.